What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the Duke Wisdom Podcast. It's been another minute since I've recorded. I've got a new podcast mic now, so hopefully you guys can hear the difference in audio quality and that sort of thing. Hopefully it'll be easier for me to not just have to stay like 2 inches away from the mic the entire time. I think that's my real goal with this new mic. But obviously some big news coming up earlier today with Sion James committing to Duke. The 6'6" graduate transfer from Tulane should be pressing hard for a lot of minutes. His third transfer to commit to Duke this offseason already. All of them have been upperclassmen, but Sion James and Mason Gillis are both graduate transfers, while Malik Brown will be a junior next season. So basically the topic of this podcast is, where does Sion James fit into Duke's rotation? And what does Duke's rotation look like next year with this many significant additions in the portal? I think you have to consider, first of all, that this could be one of the deepest Duke basketball teams of all time. And I think we've said that in years past. I think in years past, we've been like, oh, this could be like last offseason, there was this thought that Duke had a true 12-man rotation. But to be honest, I think I want to push back on that. In retrospect, we might not have been correct on that and we weren't, obviously, but it's because you look at Jaden Schutt, you look at Christian Reeves, those two guys were guys that really hadn't proven themselves as freshmen. And a lot of fans were jumping the gun thinking they were going to enter the rotation very easily. And then I always think that even when you're dealing with classes full of 5-stars, there are going to be a couple of guys who just aren't quite ready to be immediate impact guys. And I think for last year's team, TJ Power certainly fit that bill. And Sean Stewart fit that bill for most of the season as well. And so if you were Duke, you were really, that knocked you down to 8 automatically of guys who you felt like could really contribute to the team. And I think that people were also looking at Jalen Blakes with a little bit too much. I think it was pretty clear that Blakes his minutes were going to dwindle as the season went. The same thing happened in his sophomore season, and that is in fact what happened. He was forced into a little bit more postseason minutes than I think the coaching staff wanted because of Caleb Foster's injury. But when push came to shove, Duke was a 7-man rotation, 7 to 8 guys, legitimately. And that's just what it's going to be by the end of the year. It's always going to be like no more than 8 guys playing legitimate minutes. You might get spot minutes out of a 9th guy if you're pushing that rotation really far come March. And I think there's a possibility that this Duke team is like that. Look at the 2022 team, the Final Four team. That was really a 7-man rotation with Joey Baker being used if he needed to be used. And then every once in a while, spot minutes from Bates Jones. So it's like 7 true guys, an 8th guy, hit or miss. And then the 9th guy is like a spot minute guy. Is that like the rotation that Duke can roll out this year? Well, let's get into that. Want to join a community of Duke accounts publishing news, theories, and predictions on Duke athletics? Join the Duke Wisdom Network. Just go to dukewisdom.org/join network today and fill out the form with your name and social media. Or you can DM at Duke_wisdom on Twitter or Instagram. Become a part of the community of Duke fans publishing their takes today. Again, that's dukewisdom.org/join network or DM at Duke_wisdom on Twitter or Instagram. So first of all, we know Duke's starting backcourt. They really have 2 backcourt players who are true backcourt like guards, combo guard, point guard type players. That's Tyrese Proctor and Caleb Foster, the 2 returning players. The good thing about Sion James and some of these other freshmen is that they can kind of play that 2 spot. And you don't always have to have Proctor and Foster in. I think it would be beneficial to have one of them in at all times to be running the point. But you don't have to take both of them out at the same time. You take one guy out and then switch in one of the freshman kind of wing players or Sion James. Now, here's where I think it gets really interesting. I think that it's pretty clear that Cooper Flagg's starting, whether that's at the 3 or the 4. Obviously, he's got to start, but whether that's at the 3 or the 4 is the question. And then Kamen Malawach will start at the 5. I think that's pretty clear. Duke has not gone after any big men in the portal whatsoever. It seems to me that John Shire is more than comfortable rolling Kamen Malawach at the 5 from day one. And I'm increasingly becoming more confident with that idea because what he's been doing in the BAL, the Basketball African League, he's just been tearing it up, man. Games where he's scoring 25, 29 points, thunderous dunks, some turnaround jump shots, block shots galore, very good rebounder. I think this guy's going to be as trustworthy and as sturdy as a center you can ask for as a 17-year-old. I mean, obviously there's going to be bumps. It's not going to be smooth sailing completely because he's 17 years old, but I think you can't get much better out of a 17-year-old than Common Malawach and in Cooper Flagg for that matter. Both are still 17 years old. They're going to be in the lineup. Proctor and Foster are going to be starters. Honestly, I mean, does it matter so much who the fifth starter is necessarily? I think, honestly, the minute break will be fairly even between whoever that fifth starter is and a couple of guys off the bench. I have no doubt that that's the case. But I think it's interesting to discuss this because you'll see kind of how John Shire wants to play, depending on who he goes with, whether he goes with Sion James and he goes with a little bit smaller of a lineup, or if he goes a little bit bigger with Malik Brown or somewhere kind of in the middle with Mason Gillis. You'll learn a little bit about that. Not only that, you'll learn who he favors in terms of who does he see as the better player, because whoever's starting day one is probably who Shire thinks is the best player of those three. And those are the three guys I'm really going to focus on for this episode. I'm going to dive into how the rotation gets deeper after that discussion, but I don't envision Isaiah Evans or Conkanapel or anybody else, for that matter, starting from day one. I think Duke will have two freshmen in the starting lineup day one, and that'll be Flagg and Malawach. I think beyond that, those guys are going to be fighting hard for time on the floor, and I'll get into that further. But let's look at Sion James. Sion James is a very, very athletic player. He's strong. He's a veteran presence, obviously, given his age. He's a guy who entered the NBA draft, really honestly could stay in that draft and become a two-way player. Like, he's good enough right now to be on a two-way contract in the NBA. And so I think it's crazy that there's a guy like that Duke's debating on whether he starts or not. That's a heck of a thing to say. He averaged 14 points a game, 5 rebounds a game at Tulane last season. As I mentioned at the top of the episode, he's 6'6", solid size, can definitely defend well. That's a common kind of theme throughout the three transfers. They all are very capable defenders. I think that's a common theme throughout most of the roster, is they are very capable defenders. Sion James can guard 1 through 4, so that's very valuable. You can stick him pretty much anywhere in the rotation. I don't envision he plays a lot of the 4, mostly at the 2 and the 3. He's a decent passer as well, pretty good passer, some solid passing vision for James as well. And so he's an exciting prospect that I think that Duke hasn't seen a lot of really high quality graduate transfers. This is one of the highest all three of these guys are some of the highest quality transfers Duke has gotten in a long time. If we're talking about like transfer portal era, Duke has brought in, Patrick DePay for the 2021 season, who didn't really pan out. They brought in Bates Jones, who didn't do a whole lot outside of those spot minutes I mentioned earlier. They brought in Theo John, who was a good player, but he was really just there as the rough him up kind of guy. He was a decent, interior defender. He used his strength. He could get off a dunk every once in a while, but he wasn't much of an offensive threat. Then you talk about Jacob Grandison, who was solid, really kind of more of a he could shoot and he could play in the mid range. He could sneak underneath the basket, but mostly a 3-point shooter. And his percentage actually dipped in Durham a bit. And then you think about, Ryan Young, really. I mean, there's other guys, Cale Catchings, Max Johns, Neil Begovic, but those guys weren't really playing major minutes at all. So what you're really looking at is Ryan Young being the best of all of those guys, who had a really true great post game. And to me, it's like very efficient post scoring from Ryan Young at about, in his junior season, or not junior, I guess his senior season in 2023 for Duke, like, 5-6 points per game or whatever he was averaging, was solid and it was efficient, but he wasn't a tremendous defender. He didn't have tremendous athleticism. I think already you can just look at Malik Brown and go, Duke has a guy with that same level of offensive efficiency as Ryan Young. I don't know that Malik Brown is as crafty of a post scorer necessarily as Ryan Young. He doesn't have the footwork. He doesn't have the arsenal of pump fakes that Rec League had, but he's an impressive finisher around the basket. Shooting around 70% from the floor is outstanding no matter who you are. But Malik Brown is more athletic than Young, so he can play above the rim where Ryan Young really couldn't, although Ryan did have a few dunks this season, which were fun to watch. But Malik Brown, he'll be able to play above the rim a lot more. And then the real silver lining to him is the defense. He is a all-ACC defender, led the ACC in steals, and that's what really sets him apart from Young completely, is that and the athleticism. So I think Malik Brown already, just on face value, is better than Ryan Young. He's an upgrade already, as it is, a pretty decent upgrade at that. And he's got 2 years of eligibility as well, just like Ryan Young did the day he walked in the door. And so I think it's interesting to see what they can do with this. Also, I'm noticing the waveform. I apologize if I'm moving in and out and away from the mic. This is my first time with this mic, so if the audio is kind of going up and down, I do apologize for that. Hopefully, I'll get better at this as I go. But that's kind of what you're looking at in Malik Brown and what you're looking at in Sion James. And Mason Gillis, you're getting, again, a guy who's very strong. Again, a guy who can defend, is a capable defender. But you're getting, really, with him, you're getting a three-point specialist. Guy that can just step out and snipe shots. He's the Big Ten Sixth Man of the Year. I've talked at length about Gillis and Brown already. So really, for me, it's a crapshoot. It's a crapshoot. I think those three guys walk into practice and they're competing every single day with each other, really, to see who's going to be that fifth starter. Because if you want kind of a faster, more guard-like starting lineup, I think Sion James is your decision. If you want a guy that can put the ball on the floor, he can shoot threes, not as well as Gillis, but better than Brown. He is the smallest of the three, which is not really saying a lot because all three are kind of, built guys. They're tough guys. So I don't really think that's too much of a concern. I don't think defense, you're really compromising by putting one guy over the other too much necessarily. Malik Brown certainly is probably the better defender of the three, though. But I think that you want to go fast. You want a more guard-like starting lineup, which is what Duke saw for the majority of the season this past year. I think Sion James is the decision. And part of me thinks that's the way John Shire is going to go if he had it his way. Like if all three were even leveled, they all three performed the same in practice, and he really couldn't choose, I think John Shire would pick Sion James because that's the play style John Shire prefers. However, I think one of those guys is going to separate themselves. Will it be Sion James? I don't know. I think if he's going for a three-point look, if he wants more dependability from three, because Malawach can step out and hit it, but he's not exactly a sniper. Cooper Flagg can go out and hit a three. He's not exactly a sniper. Caleb Foster's a pretty good three-point shooter, but he's not like Jared McCain. And Tyrese Proctor is a fairly inconsistent three-point shooter, but I still think he should be the team's, of those four players at least, he should be the best three-point shooter by far. And I hope to see a Tyrese Proctor, the true Tyrese Proctor revolution, the kind of Tyrese Proctor that we saw against James Madison in the second round that can knock down a bunch of threes. I think Tyrese can be that guy. I think he can be a over 40% three-point shooter. So for me, it's like, well, if Proctor and Foster in practice aren't drilling threes, and in those, like in the exhibition game, if they're not hitting threes the clip that John wants to see, he might go Mason Gillis, because he might want a guy who he knows can step out and hit a dependable clip from three and then defend well and be a veteran presence and kind of give Cooper Flagg and Colin Malawach a lot of room to breathe in the paint. I think that's the main kind of benefit for Mason Gillis, is you're getting a guy that can hit those threes. He shot it at a 47% clip. I've been very candid about my belief that won't be his percentage next season. I think he will shoot much, not maybe much, but at least lower than 47% from three. Not being around Zach Edey, he won't get quite as good a looks, but he'll be getting very good looks because there will certainly be defensive attention on Malawach and Flagg in the interior in the mid-range. So I think that Gillis will get his looks and he'll help open up those paint looks for those guys and driving lanes for Foster and for Proctor. I hope to see Tyrese Proctor hit those driving lanes a little more and be a little bit less completely dependent upon that three-point game. I think as a freshman, he shot a little too many contested mid-range shots And then as a sophomore, he maybe became a little bit too single-faceted as a three-point shooter, although he still did plenty of other things. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to box him up like that. But I think that he can be such a diverse scoring threat. And now that he is the primary scoring threat on the perimeter, I think that we'll see a lot of what we thought Tyrese Proctor was going to be as a sophomore is what he will be as a junior. And I believe that truly. But I think Gillis can give a little more dependability at the three if he's the fifth starter. And then obviously you can lean into the fact if you want Cooper Flagg to have a little bit more of a perimeter duty and put him at the three, then you can put Malik Brown at the four, have a very dependable scorer in the interior and a very dependable defender. Say if Common Malowacz to start the year is a little giddy, he's a little jumpy, trying to block every single shot like a 17-year-old that's 7'2" with a, whatever, a 9'6", 9'8" reach, whatever it is. Like a guy like that would do is get a little jumpy and think he's going to block everything. I mean, we saw it with Derek Lively early. We saw it with Mark Williams in his freshman year. I think it's something we'll see for a few games. And if you want a more kind of seasoned defender who's going to be a little more disciplined from the very jump, that's Malik Brown. So that's, I think, what you get out of him. You get a dependable interior presence. So do you want to play a little bigger? Go with Malik Brown. Do you want to play a little more guard-oriented? Play with Sion James. Do you want kind of a middle ground, best of both worlds? Go with Mason Gillis. Now, regardless of who John Shire goes with for that fifth starting spot, rather, the other two guys are going to be the sixth and seventh men. I believe that. Now, there's some people that might push back on me and go like, well, what about Isaiah Evans? What about Conkinapole? What about Patrick Gongba? What about Darren Harris? Go down the list. This Duke team now has a ridiculous amount of depth. They have 11 players who you could just throw in as a starter, probably. Here's where I stand. I think Duke will see a lot of Malik Brown playing kind of a undersized five at times, because I think it might take a minute with the injury rehab of Patrick Gongba. Now, Brendan Marks has reported that Duke does not intend to redshirt Gongba, and I think that's good. If he's healthy and ready to play, let's run it, because Duke really only has two true bigs, and that's, Malowacz and Gongba, and they're both freshmen. I think Duke will see a lot of Malik Brown in the interior at the beginning of the season as well, though, whether he starts or not. But I do think that if there is one guy that can kind of creep his way into those starting discussions, it is Isaiah Evans. Slam just named him a first team All American for high school ball, which is crazy. So that's top 5 player in their mind of American players in the class of 2024. Cooper Flagg also a part of that, but that's high praise. And Isaiah Evans is a high clip scorer, man. I mean, I have no doubt about that guy. That guy's moxie, his attitude, his scoring ability, his talent. The only place I have some reservation is his defense, particularly because of his frame. He's a very, very skinny guy. He's, called Baby Ingram for a reason. He's built a lot like freshman Brandon Ingram, but just in a smaller form. He's not as tall. He's not quite as lanky as Ingram was. So for me, it's like he could get bullied by some older players at the beginning of the season. Maybe a little, maybe not bullied, but he might struggle a bit. He might struggle a bit with some older players just at the very start of the season. So I think that he's a guy that could be vying for that fifth starting spot by the end of the year because he's so talented. But I think beginning of the year, Isaiah Evans certainly not really pushing for that. And it doesn't help his case that both Sion James and Mason Gillis are vying for the exact same position as him and are older, and they're going to get it over him, especially from the jump. So I think Evans falls into a bit of an eighth man role. And honestly, it's interesting what if Malik Brown's the guy that gets the start? Then you got James and Gillis who play the same position as the sixth and seventh men. Can you really have Evans also? That's why I sort of don't think Malik Brown is going to start. I sort of think it'll be James or Gillis that gets that fifth starting spot, and then Malik Brown will be the sixth man. That makes sense to me. And he'll be the reserve for Malowacz and for Flagg as well. And then you've got whoever doesn't get the start between James and Gillis at the 7th man. And then you can play Evans with the 8th man role. For me, it's like, I think Gongba and Kinapel, depending on who's able to do better, earns 9th or 10th man, or depending on kind of the needs of the team. Do they need more shooting than Kinapel? If they need more of a big man presence, if Malawach is not getting adjusted quite fast enough, Gongba maybe. But I think that in terms of what two freshmen like last year, two freshmen that are going to fall a little bit behind, just a little bit, that won't quite be to the same level as everybody else, might be Kinapel and Gongba in a way. But there's also Darren Harris. I don't know where Darren Harris fits in. I think Darren Harris is one of the most underrated players in the country, period. I think that dude can hoop. No uncertain terms, Darren Harris is a shooter. He's a player. He was Peach Jam MVP. He led Paul VI to the national championship game where they lost to undefeated Montverde and Cooper Flag. But just a terrific play. I mean, talk about a guy that was basically the best player for the second best prep school in the country then. How is he only like just now gotten at the very end of the rankings, got into the top 30? Like, what are we doing here? He's so much better than that. And he's a player that could start and I wouldn't even be mad about it. But the way that things are panning out, it's Darren Harris is the 11th man. And Darren Harris is the 11th man. I'm like, wow, that kind of sucks, you know. And I'm worried in this. And I know that none of these guys even stepped foot on campus for workouts or anything. But I'm already worried because we've been living in the transfer portal for the past month and a half, really. And what we've learned is nobody's safe. You know, if you're not guaranteed to start, play a big role, and fit the scheme of next year's team, you're kind of an outlier. And that made everyone an outlier from last year's team, except for Proctor and Foster, the only two guys to come back. And that was an Elite 8 team. So no team is safe, is what we've learned. No player is safely back. You have to assume maybe everyone's gone until they say otherwise. I don't know. And for me, it's like if Darren Harris can't crack rotation this season, I'm automatically thinking this might be his only year in Durham. And I hate to say, I hate to even think that, especially this prematurely. I don't want to put that energy out there. But that's something that's creeping into my mind. It's like, you know, in the 6-man freshman class, how many of them are going to play a sophomore year? Dude, certainly not Flag and Malawach because they'll go to the NBA. But of the other 4, how many of those 4 guys are going to be at Duke? I don't know, because, you know, the first year of the Shire era, you would have thought that. And then you would be like, Duke's not going to get Filipowski, Proctor, and Mitchell back, but then they did, and they kept Reeves and Shoot out of the portal for a year at least, and were able to return those 5 guys when 2 went to the NBA. Maybe that's what it'll be. I mean, maybe Duke will, because right now Duke's not recruiting a very big 2025 class. So I'm talking in a sort of roundabout way right now, but Duke's not recruiting a exceptionally large 2025 class. You know, they don't have any commitments yet. I assume the first will come over the summer, but I don't think that they're getting this just really, really large class. And for me, it's like, obviously Flag's gone. Obviously Malawach is going to be gone after their freshman season. And then Sion James runs out of eligibility, as does Mason Gillis. So that's 4 guys that you know are gone right out the gate. And I think you also can kind of, I don't know. I mean, Malik Brown will probably come back. He'll play 1 more year. Then you got the freshmen as well, and you'll see what the freshmen do. But you know, and then Tyrese Proctor, I think, probably plays well enough to be an NBA basketball player after next season. And I think Proctor will probably play his last year in Durham next year. So I think if that's the case, 3 NBA entries, 2 ultimate graduates, that's losing 5 guys. And Duke hasn't, let's be clear here, Duke hasn't even filled its roster. Duke has filled 11 scholarships for next year's team. They have 2 open scholarships. I don't know if Duke uses both of those on 2 more transfers of any kind. They might. And I'm kind of talking about this like it's a finished product, because I don't think anyone else Duke gets is going to be a serious rotation player. I think that Duke has its 11 serious rotation players. And if they pick up 2 more guys in the portal, they'll be kind of like Cale Catchings, Max Johns, Neil Begovic, guys to just fill out those last couple spots. Or maybe they use one of those on a guy like that, and then they just give the 13th scholarship to Stanley Borden or something like that, you know? I don't think there's any imperative need to go get a guy who's going to press for minutes. I think you've got your 11 guys who need to play minutes next season, and let's just pump the brakes here. Fill out the roster, fill out those last 2 scholarships because you might as well. But let's keep it like this for a second and just work with what they've got. I think this is perfect, ultimately. But I'm talking about it like it's a finished product. But in that 2025 team, or 2025-2026 team, it's like, I guess if you got back the other 4 freshmen, and then you got back Malik Brown, and you got back Caleb Foster, you'd have 6 guys, and you'd have to fill another 7 scholarships, which is still a hefty ordeal in the portal and in the recruiting class. So I don't think it's actually really outlandish to think, even if if any of these freshmen don't play a lot, I think Shire committed to this big class because he wants to commit to these players longer term, and he doesn't want them to be rent of players. Now, committing to those guys for these freshmen had unintended consequence of sort of putting last year's players at odds, where it's like these guys are coming in, coexisting is going to be difficult, especially with the play style of the team shifting a little bit. And so that was an unfortunate consequence. But I think that there's a possibility, and I've talked myself into it as I've just been yapping. I think that I've talked myself into that Darren Harris, Isaiah Evans, Patrick Gongba, and Konkinapol can all play a sophomore year at Duke. And I think they might, honestly, with the way that the rosters for the coming season and the season after are coming into view. So that's that. And that's where I fall on how I think the rotation is going to pan out. There's still a lot to get through the offseason and what we'll see. And it's exciting. This is an exciting team. It feels like a very, very young team, but in reality, it's really not that young, because if you look at the first 7 guys in rotation, you'll have 2 super seniors, you'll have 2 juniors, and a sophomore. And those first 7 guys, you'll actually only have like 2 freshmen in the first 7 players in rotation. So, past that, in the next 4, you have 4 freshmen. But it's interesting. It's an interesting team that it is a roster construction like we really have never seen before. I guess the closest thing to it was Shire's first year, but I think this is the quality of transfer is much higher here. I think the quality of freshmen is probably also higher, and the quality of returner is also higher. And when you talk about that 23 team had Jeremy Roach and Jalen Blakes as the 2 returners. Love Germ to death, but Germ after his sophomore year, it was not as good as Tyrese Proctor after his sophomore year. And Jalen Blakes after his freshman year is certainly not as good as Caleb Foster after his freshman year. So better returners, better transfers. I think when you just look at it 1-1, Ryan Young, Jacob Grandis, and Cale Catchings versus Sion James, Mason Gillis, and Malik Brown. Obviously an upgrade. Freshman class. Who were the best freshmen that season? Filipowski and Lively and Proctor ended up being the better players. And I think that at least the top 2 in Flag and Malawach are giving you more than the top 2 that year. And I think it's interesting to see who could be more impactful. I think that Proctor probably had more impact as a freshman than like Isaiah Evans would have. I think this is a deeper class also of freshmen, because when you get into Kenapel, Degongba, and Harris, I think they're clearly a step ahead of, say, Chute and Reeves, and at least somewhere around where Dariq Whitehead, maybe a little worse than Dariq Whitehead. Whitehead struggled a bit because of injuries, but certainly a very talented player, especially as a shooter. But I think it'll be a really interesting team, and they're not going to be without their tests early in the season. I published an article on Duke Wisdom a couple days ago talking about how the schedule is shaping up. We now know 27 out of 31 games for the 2024-25 season. And I think it's interesting that Duke now has 5 power conference games. They have a power conference game against every conference except for the Big East, I believe. They'll start their season on November 4th against Maine, which is like a hometown team coming into enemy territory to play against Cooper Flag, and that'll be interesting for him. I think that's a fun matchup. I think they'll schedule another game against a low major or mid major that'll likely take place that following weekend on November 8th or 9th. Then they'll go to Atlanta to play Kentucky, whose roster is shaping up to be interesting, to say the least. A lot of veteran transfers. We'll see how that goes. It'll be a very interesting game with Mark Pope in Kentucky. So they'll go from Atlanta. They'll probably schedule another home game against a low major or mid major on November 15th or 16th. Then they'll go to Arizona, which is another high-level game. And then after that, they're going to go to Vegas to play against Kansas toward the end of November. And that's 3 high-quality games already. And then they got the SEC Challenge opponent, which will be a home game this year. My prediction is they play Arkansas. So, we thought we were going to have to play all of John Calipari's Kentucky players against Kentucky. Turns out we're going to have to play them all still, but just against Arkansas. Likely a home game there, but again, a 4th high major game, a 4th high major conference they're playing against. And then it was announced earlier this week by John Rothstein that Duke will be playing in Madison Square Garden against Illinois, who was a 3 seed last year. And so that gives Duke a game against everybody except the Big East. UConn, let's do it. Let's duke it out. UConn fans have been talking mad crap. Let's get that UConn game going. I want to see that UConn game going. So let's make one of those last 2 or 4 non-conference slots that are open right now. Let's make it a UConn game. Let's make things interesting. I want that game. They're also playing a game against George Mason on December 17th in Cameron, and that'll be fun. Just for the kicks and giggles, I'll run over that they have home and aways. Now that there are 18 teams in the ACC, there's only 3 home and aways. Duke's home and aways next year against Carolina, Wake Forest, and Miami. They have home games against California, Florida State, NC State, Notre Dame, Pitt, Stanford, and Virginia Tech. Those are home only. And then they have away only against Boston College, Clemson, Georgia Tech, Louisville, SMU, Syracuse, and Virginia. So it's very clear that Duke is seeking out a schedule that is irrefutable to the committee, that they have enough quad 1 opportunities, when inevitably the argument becomes the ACC is bad. Because, I just saw a ranking yesterday that was Duke at 19, Carolina at 20, which is just outlandish. Both teams are, at worst, both top 10 schools next season. And Carolina's returning a first-team All-American, and Duke's got 2 of the best freshmen in the country. I think a terrific roster construction, that I am more confident in than last season. And that was a team that was a game away from the Final Four. So I think that it's ridiculous to rank them there. But there's really, besides Duke and Carolina, there's not another top 25 team in the ACC. There's just not. And so it's going to be tough to find good wins, and it's going to be tough to fight those losses when they come to perceived inferior teams. Because even though they just put State into the Final Four and Clemson into the Elite Eight, those same players that played at State and Clemson didn't come back. And so the kind of national media perception of the ACC right now is they don't have faith in these programs anymore. That's the problem. They got temporary faith maybe in those players, but then Burns is gone, Horn is gone, Morcell is gone, Diarra is gone. And so they're like, oh, this State team's not going to do it. They weren't even good as a regular season team to begin with. And then at Clemson, they're like, oh, Gerard's gone, PJ Hall's gone. They're not going to do it either. They believe temporarily in those players, but they don't believe in the programs. And that's kind of the problem that we're fighting against. They don't believe in those programs. So when they beat Duke and Carolina next year, it looks bad for Duke and Carolina when it's not nearly as bad. And I urge people, when it happens, I know that this is just not going to happen, but when they lose to a team that everybody thinks is a middling team in the ACC, it might not be as bad as you actually think, because a middling ACC team went to the Final Four last year and another one went to the Elite Eight. So they're very capable teams is all I'm saying. And so it's important that Duke's schedule is a very tough non-conference schedule like they have, so that they can combat that narrative. A lot of interesting things happening. Certainly a couple more scholarships to be filled. So still more news to come this offseason. We're in mid-May and the news keeps on coming. And I think next episode, I'll be talking a little bit about Duke in the NBA stuff. A little bit more Duke in the NBA specialty episode. That one should be interesting. As always, thank you guys for listening. Let me know how the mic is. Yeah, let me know how the mic's doing. You can hit me up on Twitter, Instagram, leave it in the YouTube comments, leave a comment on Spotify or Apple or Amazon, wherever you're listening. Thanks so much for listening, guys, and I'll talk to you later.